Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The house at the end of the street hides a terrible secret. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The New Beginning. Emily Parker tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she drove past the weathered sign welcoming her to Hawthorne Grove, a small town nestled in the hills of the American Northeast. The town seemed almost quaint, with its tree-lined streets and colonial houses, a place where life moved slowly. But as she turned onto Willow Lane, the charm began to fade. The house loomed at the end of the street, like a forgotten relic of a darker time. It was a grand, old Victorian mansion, its once white paint now peeling and gray. Vines choked the life out of the wrought iron fence surrounding the property, while the yard was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds. The gate swung open with a screech that echoed in the still afternoon air, setting Emily's nerves on edge. She had inherited the house from an estranged relative she barely knew, a great-aunt her mother had mentioned once in passing. The old woman had lived alone for years, and after her death, the house had come to Emily, along with a cryptic letter warning her to be careful. But Emily wasn't in a position to be choosy. After everything she had been through, this house was a fresh start, a place to leave behind the painful memories of a life that had fallen apart. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed the neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, their faces quickly disappearing when they saw her look their way. The few people outside walked briskly past, avoiding eye contact, as if acknowledging the house might bring them bad luck. It was as if the mansion at the end of Willow Lane was a specter, something better left ignored. Emily shook off the unease, creeping up her spine, and headed inside. The interior was as neglected as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and something else she couldn't quite place. Still, she couldn't deny the beauty beneath the decay: ornate woodwork, grand staircases, and stained glass windows that cast colorful, muted light across the floor. But as she explored, she came upon a door in the attic that refused to open. The knob rattled, but it wouldn't turn, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Emily's curiosity flickered, but she brushed it aside, convincing herself it was just an old house's quirks. That night, the mansion groaned and creaked as she lay in bed, trying to settle into her new life. She heard scratching sounds in the walls and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Emily pulled the covers tighter, telling herself it was just the house settling. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Chapter 2. Unsettling Discoveries. Emily woke the next morning with the unsettling feeling that something had changed, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The night had been long and filled with restless dreams, where shadows moved on their own and whispers echoed through the house. She had convinced herself it was just her imagination, an old house settling and nothing more. Determined to make the best of her new start, she decided to explore the town of Hawthorne Grove and maybe find some company at the local diner. The Willow Diner was a cozy place, its walls adorned with photographs from the town's past. The smell of fresh coffee and fried eggs filled the air as Emily stepped inside, her hopes lifted by the warmth of the place. She sat at the counter and ordered breakfast, trying to strike up a conversation with the waitress. But when she mentioned the house at the end of Willow Lane, the woman's friendly demeanor vanished. "You're living there?" she asked, her voice tight. Before Emily could answer, the waitress quickly walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Undeterred, Emily tried speaking with a few of the other diners, but their reactions were the same: strained smiles, quick nods, and then silence. It was as if the entire town shared a secret they didn't dare speak aloud. Just as she was about to give up, an elderly woman sitting in the corner, beckoned her over. "Mrs. Hargrove," she introduced herself with a thin smile, her eyes sharp and watchful. "You be careful in that house, dear. It's seen more than its share of tragedy." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, leaning in. But Mrs. Hargrove just shook her head. "Some things are better left alone. Just be careful," she repeated, her voice full of warning. Later that day, back at the house, Emily tried to push the encounter out of her mind. But as she walked through the dusty halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house felt different, heavier, somehow. In the living room, she noticed a picture frame lying face down on the mantel, though she was certain she had left it upright. A chair in the corner had been moved, its legs scraping against the floor as if dragged by unseen hands. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she told herself it was just the drafty old house playing tricks on her. As she explored the attic again, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up and found an old, dusty journal hidden beneath. The leather cover was cracked with age, and inside, the yellowed pages were filled with the spidery handwriting of Henry Parker, the original owner of the house. Emily read with growing unease, as Henry wrote of the darkness that had consumed his family, a force he believed was tied to the house. He described strange rituals and a room that no one should ever enter, a place where something unspeakable lurked. That night, Emily could hardly sleep. The house was silent, but she was on edge, every creak and groan sending a jolt of fear through her. Then, just as she was drifting off, she heard footsteps, soft and slow, just outside her bedroom door. Her breath caught in her throat. She waited, listening, but when she gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there. But Emily knew she wasn't imagining it. Something was in the house with her, and it was only a matter of time before it made itself known. Chapter 3. The Town's Dark Secrets. Emily barely slept that night, her mind racing with thoughts of the journal and the eerie events that had begun to plague her since moving into the house. The footsteps she had heard outside her bedroom door haunted her, making her question whether staying in the house was a mistake. But she refused to give in to fear. There had to be a logical explanation for everything that was happening. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily decided to dig deeper into the house. The next morning, she made her way to the town library, hoping to find answers. The library was a quaint, old building, its walls lined with dusty books that seemed to hold the town's forgotten stories. Emily approached the front desk, where a gray-haired man with thick glasses sat reading a newspaper. His name tag read Mr. Collins. "Excuse me," Emily began, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for information on the old Victorian house at the end of Willow Lane. Do you have any records on it?" Mr. Collins lowered his newspaper and gave her a long, appraising look. "That house, huh? You're living there?" Emily nodded, noticing the flicker of concern in his eyes. After a moment, he sighed and stood up, leading her to a dusty corner of the library where old town records were kept. "Parker House has a dark history," he said, pulling out a few musty files. "It's been abandoned for decades. The last occupants, well, they all disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one knows what happened to them." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she flipped through the records. The names of the previous owners were all there, along with brief notes on their disappearances. No bodies were ever found, just empty houses, as if the people had simply vanished. "There's more to it, though," Mr. Collins added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The land the house was built on, it's cursed. Long before the town existed, this was a site for ancient rituals. Dark rituals. The kind of things people don't like to talk about." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe it was just town folklore, but the unease growing inside her was hard to ignore. She thanked Mr. Collins and left the library, her mind buzzing with questions. As she walked back to the house, Emily ran into her neighbor, Tom, a middle-aged man who looked like he had seen better days. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her stop. "You live in that house, don't you?" Tom asked, his voice slurred but serious. "You need to get out of there. That place, it ain't right. I've seen things, you know. Things you wouldn't believe." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Tom leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That house, it was the site of a mass disappearance years ago. The town covered it up, but everyone knows. Whole families just vanished, and nobody did a damn thing about it. They say the place is cursed, that it'll take anyone who stays too long." Emily recoiled at his words, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm sure there's an explanation. Maybe the families just left town." Tom shook his head vehemently. "No, they didn't just leave. They were taken. That house, whatever's in there, it's hungry, and it won't stop until it's fed." Despite Tom's warnings, Emily found herself growing more resolute. She couldn't let fear drive her away. Whatever had happened in the past, she was determined to uncover the truth. The strange occurrences, the whispers, the footsteps, it had to be something she could explain, something that wouldn't drive her out of the only place she had left. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the house. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Chapter 4. The Presence. The days following her encounter with Tom were a blur of growing dread and unease for Emily. Each night brought new horrors, subtle at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore. The house seemed alive with a malevolent energy, as if it was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing hour. It started with the handprints. One morning, Emily woke to find her bedroom walls covered in smudged, childlike handprints. They were everywhere on the wallpaper, the door, even the ceiling. Panic surged through her as she wiped at them frantically, only to realize the marks wouldn't come off. The prints were not just on the surface. They seemed embedded in the very walls themselves. The shadows followed next. They crept along the edges of her vision, slithering up the walls and across the floors without any discernible source. At first, she tried to rationalize them tricks of the light, or her eyes playing games with her exhausted mind. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the way they seemed to move with purpose, as though they were watching her, waiting. Then came the cold spots, freezing pockets of air that appeared without warning, chilling her to the bone. They would materialize in random places: the kitchen, the hallway, even her bed. Emily would walk through one, feeling the temperature plummet suddenly, her breath fogging in front of her. It was as if the house was trying to drive her out, pushing her to the edge of her sanity. But the worst were the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, until she could no longer ignore them. They whispered her name, over and over, in voices that were both familiar and foreign, as if they belonged to people long dead. The voices came from the walls, the floors, the very air around her, surrounding her in a cacophony of terror that she couldn't escape. Emily became obsessed with the locked door in the attic. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it in her dreams, an imposing, ancient door that seemed to pulse with dark energy. In her nightmares, it would creak open slowly, revealing a gaping void that sucked in all light, all hope, leaving only an overwhelming sense of dread. Desperate to uncover what lay behind it, Emily called a locksmith, a gruff man who arrived with a bag full of tools and a skeptical expression. But no matter what he tried, the door refused to yield. The lock wouldn't turn, the hinges wouldn't budge, and the man eventually left, muttering about cursed houses and wasting his time. Emily was left alone with her fear, the door mocking her from the corner of the attic. As the days passed, Emily's isolation grew. Townspeople, already distant, seemed to fade from her world altogether. She stopped visiting the diner, stopped making any effort to connect with others. The house became her entire existence, its walls closing in around her, suffocating her with their oppressive presence. Her reality twisted in on itself, leaving her to question everything. Was the house truly haunted, or was her own mind turning against her? The trauma of her past, the betrayal, the loss, the unbearable grief had driven her to seek refuge in this place. But now, she wondered if she was losing herself to it, if the darkness that consumed the house was merely a reflection of the darkness within her. Emily stood in front of the locked door, trembling, her hand hovering over the cold, unyielding knob. She could feel the presence behind it, waiting, watching, just as she knew it had been for all those who had come before her. And she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't rest until it had her too. Chapter 5. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the journal trembling in her hands. The whispers, the shadows, the chilling cold spots, all of it seemed to make more sense as she read deeper into Henry Parker's words. The man's once neat handwriting had become increasingly erratic as the pages went on, a reflection of his descent into madness. He spoke of the house as if it were a living, breathing entity, a malevolent force that fed on the fear, pain, and misery of those who dared to live within its walls. Henry's accounts were disturbing, filled with details of sleepless nights and ghastly visions. He had become convinced that the house was alive, a dark presence that grew stronger with each passing day. He wrote about a ritual, something he had been desperate enough to try, hoping to seal the darkness away. The ritual was meant to trap the evil in the hidden room behind the locked door in the attic, the same door that now consumed Emily's thoughts. But Henry's last entries were filled with doubt and fear. He wasn't sure if the ritual had worked, and the final pages were almost incoherent, rambling about the darkness escaping, about how the house was never truly safe. Emily could feel the panic in his words, and it mirrored the growing terror in her own heart. If Henry, the man who had built the house, couldn't stop the evil, what hope did she have? Her hands shook as she closed the journal, the final words echoing in her mind. It will never be enough. The darkness cannot be contained. She had to know more. There had to be something, anything, that could help her understand what was happening. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Emily returned to the attic, her eyes searching for clues she might have missed. The shadows seemed to dance around her, teasing her from the corners of the room, as if daring her to uncover the secrets they hid. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her dread pressing down on her before forcing herself to move forward. She was inspecting the walls when she noticed a loose board in the floor, partially concealed beneath a rotting trunk. Pulling the trunk aside, she pried the board up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside were old photographs and documents, yellowed with age but still intact. As she sifted through them, her breath caught in her throat. One photograph showed a young Henry Parker standing beside a man she recognized, a man who looked strikingly like her estranged relative from whom she had inherited the house. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Her family was connected to the Parker family in ways she had never known. The blood that ran through her veins was tied to this house, to its cursed history, and perhaps even to the darkness that dwelled within it. Among the documents, she found references to a pact, an agreement made by the Parker family generations ago to protect the town from the evil that lurked within the house. In exchange for their safety, the Parker family had agreed to contain the darkness, to keep it from spreading. But the pact had been broken, and the curse had returned with a vengeance, now threatening to claim Emily as its next victim. The shadows in the room seemed to close in on her as she read, their presence more oppressive than ever. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and insistent than the last. She felt the weight of the house bearing down on her, as if it knew she had discovered the truth, as if it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emily's fear had reached a fever pitch. She could no longer deny it. The house wanted her, and it would stop at nothing until it had consumed her completely. She was no longer just a resident in the Parker house. She was its prey. Chapter 6. The Haunted Past. Emily's sleep was no longer a refuge. It had become a battleground. Her nightmares, once vague and fleeting, now gripped her with terrifying clarity. Each night, the horrors of the house melded seamlessly with the shadowy fragments of her past. She dreamed of her childhood home, the place where she had felt safe until that terrible night. In her dreams, the walls of her old house would twist and darken, becoming the oppressive corridors of the Parker mansion. And in every corner, in every shadow, a figure watched her, its eyes burning into her soul. She would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. But the worst part was the memory that surfaced each time she awoke her parents' death. The car crash that had taken them from her when she was just a child, leaving her orphaned and alone. She had been told it was an accident, a freak occurrence on a rainy night. But in the pit of her stomach, she had always felt there was more to the story. As the nightmares grew more vivid, so did her suspicions. The shadowy figure that haunted her dreams. Was it the same presence that lurked in the house? Was her family's tragic past somehow connected to the curse of the Parker mansion? The idea gnawed at her, driving her deeper into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. The haunting in the house escalated, no longer content to merely frighten her. It became physical, violent. One morning, as she descended the grand staircase, she felt a sudden, forceful shove against her back. She tumbled down the steps, landing hard on the wooden floor, gasping for breath. Pain shot through her limbs, but what terrified her more was the realization that she hadn't tripped something had pushed her. Later that night, Emily lay in bed, her body aching from the fall. She tried to stay awake, fearing what might come if she closed her eyes. But exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. She was jolted awake by a cold, suffocating presence. Her eyes flew open, and there, at the foot of her bed, stood a ghostly figure, a woman, her face pale and hollow, her eyes two empty voids that bore into Emily's soul. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched her, its silent gaze more terrifying than any scream. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she froze, paralyzed by fear. But as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the chilling memory of its presence. Desperation clawed at her. She had to leave the house. She couldn't stay another night in this hellish place. But when she tried to escape, she found the front door locked tight, the windows sealed as if welded shut. She tried the phone, only to find it dead, the line cut off from the outside world. She was trapped, a prisoner in a house that seemed intent on destroying her. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She wouldn't let the house take her. She knew she had to confront whatever was haunting her, had to face the darkness that had claimed the lives of so many before her. The locked room in the attic called to her, its presence looming large in her mind. Whatever lay behind that door held the key to the house's curse, and possibly her only chance at survival. With trembling hands, she gathered what little courage she had left. She was done running. If the house wanted a fight, she was ready to give it one. Time had come to face the past and the darkness that had haunted her family for generations. She would break into the locked room and cover the truth, no matter what it cost her. Chapter 7. The Ritual. Emily paced the attic, her breath shallow and her heart racing. She had gathered everything from Henry Parker's journal, a set of old keys, a ceremonial dagger with a tarnished blade, and a mirror that seemed to hum with a faint, eerie glow. Each item was said to hold a part of the ritual necessary to confront the darkness lurking behind the locked door. The journal's spine had yielded a final key, one that seemed to pulse with a cold, malevolent energy as she held it. As she approached the locked door, she felt the house's oppressive presence pressing in on her, making her skin prickle. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and she could almost hear the house's heartbeat echoing through the walls. Determined to end the nightmare, she steeled herself and began the ritual. The journal had detailed the steps with grim precision. She arranged the items in a specific pattern in front of the door, the ceremonial dagger at the center, the mirror angled just so, and the old keys placed around it. Emily took a deep breath and began chanting the ancient words written in the journal, her voice trembling but growing more confident with each utterance. As the incantation filled the air, the house seemed to come alive with this sinister energy. The walls groaned, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the room. Shadows twisted and danced around her, moving independently of any light source, their shapes morphing to grotesque forms that seemed to reach out for her. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Emily could see her breath forming clouds of mist in front of her. The key in her hand felt heavier with every second. She inserted it into the lock, and with a reluctant click, the door began to creak open. A wave of stifling darkness poured out, an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light. The overpowering sense of dread was almost tangible, pressing down on her like a physical weight. When the door was fully open, Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was a void of darkness, filled with the remnants of a past ritual. Burned candles lay scattered on the floor, their wax long since hardened in grotesque shapes. Symbols were carved into the wooden floor, their intricate designs smeared with dried blood that had long since darkened into a sinister, crusty patina. As she stepped further into the room, the door slammed shut behind her with a resounding thud. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The darkness was absolute, an oppressive, suffocating blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She could hear the low, menacing whispers again, but this time they were not her own fears speaking. They were voices from the house, ancient and filled with malevolent intent. A voice broke through the cacophony, one that was unmistakably Henry Parker's. His tone was filled with a desperate warning. You've unleashed it. You don't know what you've done. The darkness. It's far worse than you can imagine. Emily's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. She had thought she was preparing to confront the evil, but she had unknowingly opened a door to something far more terrifying. The room felt alive, its darkness shifting and coiling around her, closing in like a predator. Panic surged within her as she stumbled backward, her fingers scrabbling at the door, but it remained firmly shut. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm, a heartbeat that was not her own. She was trapped, alone, and the fear that had haunted her for so long was now materializing into something far more real and horrifying. As Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, she realized that the true confrontation was only beginning. The darkness had been unleashed, and now it was ready to claim its new victim. Chapter 8. The Terrible Secret Revealed. The darkness in the room was absolute, a smothering void that seemed to press in from every direction. Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she tried to adjust to the suffocating blackness. She could barely make out the flickering shadows cast by the remnants of the ritual symbols etched into the floor, smeared with dark stains that had once been blood. The oppressive silence was shattered by a low, guttural growl. From the depths of the darkness, a shape began to coalesce, its form shifting and writhing as if struggling to maintain solidity. It was an amorphous entity, a mass of shadow and malice, exuding a palpable sense of ancient evil. The air grew colder, thick with a sense of malevolent anticipation. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she forced herself to step forward, her eyes straining to discern the entity's features. A voice, deep and resonant with otherworldly power, filled the room. "You've come to understand," it said, each word dripping with an ancient hatred. "The house is a gateway to a realm of suffering. It feeds on the pain of those who enter, a festering wound in the fabric of existence. The Parker family's pact was to contain me, but their betrayal set me free." The entity's words struck Emily like a physical blow. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a conduit to a place of endless torment. The Parker family's pact had been meant to keep this evil contained, but when they failed, it had been unleashed. And now, Emily was caught in the aftermath of their failure. As the entity's form shifted, Emily realized with a jolt that her family was intertwined with this curse. Her parents' deaths, her sense of being haunted, everything now made a terrible sort of sense. The darkness that had plagued her life was linked to the very pact that had failed, and she was the last in a line of sacrifices. Despair gave way to grim resolve. She had to end this. The ritual had to be completed to seal the entity back into the house, but it came with a terrible price: her own life. She had seen the symbols etched into the floor, the final step in the ritual. With shaking hands, Emily took the ceremonial dagger and pressed it against her skin, preparing to carve the symbols into her flesh. The entity roared, a sound of pure, unbridled fury as it sensed her intent. Shadows surged around her, slashing at her with cold, invisible talons. Emily winced as the blade cut into her skin, the pain sharp and biting, but she pressed on, her vision blurring with sweat and tears. Each symbol carved was a painful reminder of the sacrifice she was making, but she knew it was the only way to end the suffering. The entity's howls grew more desperate as Emily completed the ritual. Shadows coiled and lashed out, their anger a physical force that battered against her. But she persevered, the symbols carved deeply into her flesh, the final act of sealing the evil that had plagued her family for generations. As the last symbol was completed, a blinding light erupted from the floor, pushing the darkness back. The entity's howls turned into a cacophony of rage as it was forced back into the void. Emily felt a sudden, crushing weight lift from her, but the room began to spin as her strength ebbed away. In her final moments, Emily heard a faint click, the sound of the door unlocking. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the malevolent presence was forced back into its dark realm. Silence settled over the mansion, deep and profound. Emily's vision faded as she collapsed, her final thought a fleeting sense of peace, knowing that she had ended the nightmare.